Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am once again joined by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, the great Nathan Jahnke. Nate, we're live again on the YouTubes and the Twitterverse here. Week 8 is officially wrapped now, and we're heading into our Week 9 waiver wire targets. It's wide receiver week. It feels like we don't have nearly as many running backs as in previous weeks, and despite the tight ends stealing a bunch of the attention on National Tight Ends Day, there's going to be a lot to focus on with the wide receivers this week, thanks to like injuries and trades and stuff like that. So, how you doing, sir? Did you enjoy National Tight End Day?
Yes, I did, since I hyped up getting all the good tight ends at the beginning of the year, and a lot of them have started doing better, so that's been good to see, and had a couple close matchups heading into Monday Night Football, won all 3 of them, so it was a good week for me in Fantasyland.
Yes, that was the same for me. It's always a sweat on Monday Night Football in those close matchups, but luckily was able to squeak out a few key Week 8 wins. So feeling good about that. But like I said, we're live again. We're going to go through our waiver targets here, but feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll kind of get to them as we go through the list here and as they make sense. Not necessarily immediately or anything like that. Just as if you bring up a question about a certain position, we'll probably bring it up when we're covering that position, for example. So feel free to ask the questions, and we will try to get to them as we go through the episode. You can also reference Nate's waiver wire article, which is on pff.com right now, and you could get access to that with a PFF Plus subscription, as well as our many other valuable tools and resources. So make sure you get in there, worth the subscription for sure. And Nate, we're going to start right away with the running backs, and we'll start with the running back that we watched most recently here in Week 8, Tyrone Tracy of the New York Giants. Continued to work as the lead running back with Devin Singletary still in the mix. This was a pleasant surprise, and he's available still in just over 50% of ESPN leagues as well.
Last week it was looking good for Tracy. Singletary had missed the 2 weeks, came back from injury. Tracy was the starter in that game, was playing the clear majority of snaps, but there were a couple of drives where Tracy wasn't on the field, and Singletary was limited in practice heading into that week, so there was a little bit of concern that they were just limiting Singletary because of the injury and that Singletary would get more work this week. But this week we saw Tracy continue to be the clear lead back, and it was every single drive until middle of the fourth quarter where Tracy started each drive and was in for the first 2 or 3 plays. And then if the drive lasted a couple plays longer, that's when Singletary came in. So it was great to see Tracy have that role. Only available in just over 50% of ESPN leagues, so hopefully he's available in yours, but a lot of leagues he was already taken. And then right near the end, it looked like he probably suffered a concussion, had injury, was checked out, and then went to the locker room. So that's usually not a great sign. So Tracy might not be available this upcoming week, considering it's only a 6-day break instead of 7. In which case Singletary would be the starter for a week, but I would still pick up Tracy for the long term. Not only is he the only running back on the waiver wire that's going to be a starter over the course of the rest of the season, but the Giants also have a pretty favorable schedule for running backs the rest of the way. So I think he can not only be on your team, but in your starting lineup for a number of weeks over the rest of the season.
Yeah, I like it. He looked good last night, and I mean, he gave us a couple injury scares. Really, I think he had the shoulder injury stuff at the end of the first half, right? And then, did they say that it was a concussion that they were checking him for? Because I didn't see
I saw head injury. It might have just been like everyone speculating it was a head injury, though I don't know if they announced it. And it was so late in the game that they might not have had time to announce it either.
Yeah, and it looked like it. Like just looking on the replay too, like Cam Hayward kind of tackled him, and his head did hit the ground. So it would make sense. And then I mean, if it is a concussion, there's a good chance that he misses this week. But I'm with you. Like he's looked the best among the Giants running backs, so it makes sense that he continues in that lead back role. But let's talk about some guys that maybe aren't necessarily in lead roles right now, Nate, but some handcuffs, because we know that the injury Grim Reaper is still out there lurking in the shadows waiting to pounce. So we have to be ready as long as we have the roster space. And that's kind of what these next 4 names are all about. Talking, Blake Corum for the Los Angeles Rams, Braylon Allen of the New York Jets, Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals, and Kenneth Gainwell for the Philadelphia Eagles, all available in 75% of leagues or more. So how are you feeling about this group, and anyone that maybe you're prioritizing over the rest if you have to choose right now?
Sure. So first off, this shows a dramatic difference in what the waiver wire looked like 2 weeks ago, when it seemed like there were 10 different running backs available on the waiver wire, all of which could be starting in the near future. Right now, running backs are relatively healthy across the league. I know we just talked about Tracy potentially having a concussion, but outside of that, it's like Pacheco with the Chiefs, who could be back soon, Christian McCaffrey, who could be back soon. And outside of that, teams are relatively healthy at running back. So we don't have great immediate options off the waiver wire at running back, but a lot of these players are players who would be clear starters if the starter gets injured, and they have good schedules over the rest of the year. I've really, over this past weekend, looked at the schedules over these final 9 weeks of the NFL or fantasy season to see which players have good and bad schedules, to see who you should pick up. So all of these players, like, there are plenty of backup running backs. Anyone could get injured. So there's no guarantee that these are the running backs that will work out. But if they do get or if the starter does get injured, they have the best chance to be a top 10 running back, top 15 running back the rest of the way. Corum in particular, like, we've seen the Rams have a clear lead running back year after year after year. And if someone gets injured, then the backup becomes a clear lead running back. And they've had 7 or 8 running backs who have had that workhorse 65, 70+% of snaps role. So if something does happen to Kyren Williams, even though Blake Corum hasn't had that standalone value that we hope for this season, I think Corum would be a league winner if something were to happen to Kyren Williams, because he would have that role. And then Braylon Allen, similar. The Jets have a great schedule, and he's looked very good. One of the highest rated running backs so far this season in terms of his rushing production. Trey Benson, another one, hasn't had great production, but especially around the fantasy playoffs, his schedule looks great. Faces the Patriots, the Panthers, the Rams. If Benson is the starter by that time, they will be running over and over and over against the Patriots and the Panthers with Benson. So just another player who would run a lot. And then Kenneth Gainwell doesn't have the same hype as these other younger running backs who were drafted highly, and we hope we see a lot of Gainwell. We kind of know what we're getting with him, but the Eagles just, again, have a really good schedule over the rest of the season for running backs. Still have a good offensive line, and then even though they drafted Will Shipley really hasn't had that much of a role in the offense. A couple of plays here and there where he's on the field with another running back, and then has just come in late in the fourth quarter and blowout wins. So I think Gainwell would be the clear every down running back if something were to happen to Saquon Barkley.
Love it. So next up is Isaac Guerendo, the rookie in San Francisco, rostered in just 4% of ESPN leagues. Nate, we saw him have no problem racking up yards against that Dallas Cowboys run defense on Sunday night. He took 14 carries for 85 yards and a score, added 3 catches for 17, which in large part was due to Jordan Mason suffering yet another in-game injury, which took him out for this game. So Guerendo has found himself on the list this week for the 49ers backfield.
Yeah, second straight game where Jordan Mason was not able to finish the game. So like you said, he looked very good. He's on this list because he is the only other back outside of Tracy that has a decent enough chance of being a starter at some point in the next 2 weeks. The only problem is the 49ers have their bye week this week, so that's a decent amount of time for Jordan Mason to heal up. And then they are also expecting Christian McCaffrey back in 2 weeks from now. So probably not a high chance that he's the starter, but he does make the list just because he does have that really small percentage of being a starter in the next 2 weeks, where everyone else requires an injury for them to be a starter in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, like you said, there's the bye week, obviously, for week 9. I know there's optimism that Christian McCaffrey can return for week 10, which would obviously hurt Guerendo's value, but no guarantees there, and still a nice kind of speculative add just in case. So here's 2 more names that apparently are rumored to be on the trade block, Nate, at least according to NFL Network's Ian Rappaport. It's Khalil Herbert of the Chicago Bears, or currently of the Chicago Bears, and Miles Sanders, currently of the Carolina Panthers. So both of these guys on the trade block, apparently. Do you have a preferred destination for them where we could see their value increase?
It's the same destination that it's been all offseason. It's the Dallas Cowboys, who haven't invested much in a running back. They put Dalvin Cook on the active roster this week, and he just happened to have a larger role than they probably expected, with Rico Dowdle coming down with some kind of illness. And Cook didn't look all that great in that role. So if the Cowboys want to contend this year, it probably makes sense to upgrade at running back. So Khalil Herbert's probably the one that makes the most sense to me to get traded. His contract's much easier to trade for one. He's looked better recently for another, and he was a healthy and active this past week. Travis Homer, the receiving third down back / special teams player, came off of injured reserve, became the third running back for Chicago, did not regain his third down role, but it was enough to make Herbert a healthy and active. So, like, even if something were to happen to DeAndre Swift, it seems like Roshan Johnson would just become the early down back. So Herbert doesn't seem to have a role on this team. So hopefully the Cowboys come calling, but outside of that, there's really not a ton of other destinations that make sense for a team wanting a running back. The Raiders came to mind just because the running backs haven't been all that effective, but I'm not sure that's so much on the running backs as it is the rest of the team. So don't know if a trade for a running back would make sense. Plus, they have a losing record and are probably not making the playoffs this year, so they're not looking to make a run. The Chargers were the only other team that kind of made sense to me, just because the running backs haven't always been the most efficient. J.K. Dobbins has gotten a lot of volume, and that's helped his fantasy production, but his PFF grade hasn't been all that great. The rest of their running backs haven't graded all that well in the run, and with how much they want to emphasize the run game, I could see them potentially trading for someone, but those were really the only landing spots. But just generally, if either of these guys get traded, I'd rather, if I have a roster spot, pick them up now because their value will be a bit higher once the trade actually does happen. So easier to pick them up now when no one else is probably trying to pick them up in your league.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? Like, they're available in over 90% of leagues here, and you got to assume if somebody does trade for them that it's because they're going to need them and use them, right? So obviously the value is going to increase there more so than what they're doing on their current teams, not getting used as much. And then last running back on the list this week is Keaton Mitchell of the Baltimore Ravens, our usual suspect at the end of here for deep leagues, looking at him as a potential stash in Baltimore just in case, Nate.
Yeah, he played very, very well last year, was one of the best running backs on a per play basis, one of the highest graded runners, then just suffered that ACL tear near the end of last season. The good news here is he did return to practice last week, so that was good to see. They have that 3-week practice window where he gets to practice before they put him on the active roster. Would not be surprised if they use that entire 3 weeks to get him more up to speed, but that is a good sign that he should be coming back sometime in the middle of November, in which case he'd be, in my opinion, the handcuff to Derrick Henry. I think Justice Hill would clearly just stay the third down back, and Mitchell would be the guy if something were to happen to Henry. The Ravens don't have the greatest schedule for running backs, but Mitchell is just too talented to not want him on my roster.
I like it. So that's the end of our running backs here. Like we said, not as many running backs this week, which I guess could be a good thing because it means that the players are relatively healthy, right? So before we go on to the wide receivers, I do want to give a quick shout out to our friends at DraftKings Pick 6. The best part of football season, checking out the post-game stats. Which wideouts scored more than 2 touchdowns? Which quarterbacks threw for less than 350 yards? Think you can pick who will do what before kickoff? Then play Pick 6 from DraftKings, an official daily fantasy partner of the NFL. Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app, select between 2 and 6 players, and choose if they'll have more or less of a stat. It's that simple. And for all first-time Pick 6 players, check this out. New customers play $5 on your first pick set. Get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Download the new DraftKings Pick 6 app now and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers to play $5 on your first pick set. Get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Only on DraftKings Pick 6. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. In Connecticut, must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits expire in 6 months. Limited time offer. See terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos. All right. Let's get into the wide receivers now. This is a group that, again, like we said at the top, thanks to all the injuries and trades, just, overall movement at the wide receiver position over these past couple of weeks. we're going to need some help here. I know, yeah, not bad. You on Twitter says, I have Kirk and Diggs. I desperately need a wide receiver. Well, this is the section for you here. And we're going to have a lot of new names to the list here. And one of those new names happens to be Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns, who we did talk about last week. And then he went and had a hell of a game on Sunday with old Jameis throwing him the ball. He gets 9 targets, brings in 7 of them for 99 yards and 2 touchdowns. No surprise that he's at the top of the list here, Nate. How are you feeling about Cedric Tillman?
I'm feeling decent about him. He definitely took over the X receiving role that Amari Cooper had in this offense. And now with Jameis Winston at quarterback, the offense is playing a lot better, which is good to see. Also with Nick Chubb at running back, also helping the offense a little bit in the run game too. So in general, the Browns offense is looking more optimistic. Tillman, like we were saying last week, was great to see him play well in one game, but we wanted to see it over a larger sample. And now he's done it over 2 games. So that puts him at the top of the list. And basically anyone who has a waiver wire article anywhere has him as the top wide receiver. I would say the one concern I have is the Browns have a pretty brutal schedule for their passing game over the rest of the season. In general, looking at the schedules, there are players that tend to have good or bad ones. The Browns are probably the most extreme in any one direction in how tough their schedule is for wide receivers, just consistently facing teams that are in the top 10 at preventing points to wide receivers. Played the Pittsburgh Steelers twice in that stretch, and they've generally done pretty well against wide receivers. Even though I would definitely pick up Tillman before I pick up any of the other wide receivers on this list and think he has a chance to be a fantasy starter in a number of matchups, I just don't think he will have quite as much upside as we've seen so far because the matchups do get a lot more difficult. Like this past week, they played the Ravens, and the Ravens are one of the top teams at allowing fantasy points to wide receivers this year.
Yeah, that's a good call. Because I was wondering, like looking at that Browns receiving core, like thinking about Elijah Moore as well. Like I know he was kind of third in the pecking order of wide receivers there, at least in terms of playing time, right? But he also led the team in target rate, 33.3%, yards per route run, 2.58 in this last game. He had a really nice day and was someone that, he's kind of flashed potential. He just hasn't been able to kind of put it together consistently. So I wonder now, with Amari Cooper gone and maybe that opportunity there, if he can do anything with it. Like you said, the schedule, not great. It's hard to trust, the Browns offense at this point. I know it's just one game, but Jameis did look good, but I don't know. Elijah Moore is just somebody that I'm kind of keeping an eye on because he does have that potential, and he looked good, at least in this first game here with Jameis and with Amari Cooper out of the picture.
Fair. And I was like, glance over my notes again. They also play the 4 teams that are the best 4 teams at preventing fantasy points to wide receivers over these next 7 games.
Yeah, so not ideal there. But Nate, I didn't think we'd see Josh Downs back on the waiver list again, but just barely makes the cut because he's rostered in 49% of ESPN leagues. Obviously, the concern may be about his connection with Anthony Richardson, had folks kind of moving on, but it only took one play on Sunday, a 69-yard touchdown to bring back some hope. So how are you feeling about Josh Downs after week 8?
Feeling pretty good. It was a case where when we were talking about picking him up before, I had a lot of people reach out and say, but what about when Anthony Richardson is back at quarterback? And the one good note is Downs' first game back, he still had a target share over 30% or targets per run over 30% with Richardson. So I wasn't super concerned about Richardson at quarterback. And then he had that one bad game a week ago, but then he stepped it back up this week. So feeling good about that just by itself. And then just the increased chances that Richardson might not be the starter going forward. Had a relatively poor game this past week. Instead of the coaches giving him that commitment of like, no, he's our quarterback, they said, we'll evaluate things. So that's never a great sign for a quarterback. So a chance we are back to Flacco at quarterback, in which case Downs value would be going up a little bit as well. So Downs has had a very high target share in every game this season, except for the one, and has played very well in almost every game this year that he's been healthy. So even though he's probably not available in your league because he's only available in 50% of leagues, I still wanted to bring him up just in case he is available.
Yeah, it's a good call. And his best games were with Joe Flacco. So them not committing to the quarterback, I just don't know. like outside of injury, I don't know, can you really bench Richardson at this point? Like spending so much on him, he's just still so raw and like inexperienced. I feel like he needs the reps, but I don't know. We'll see what happens in the back
Yeah,
half of the season.
they have a chance to like make the playoffs and win the division though, and like
Yeah,
Richardson's completing 40 something percent of his passes. I looked at his accuracy percentage, and it's among the worst four quarterbacks in the past decade over the first 8 games of the season. So he is not being effective passing the ball. So if they want to play for the long term, then keep going with Richardson. But if you want to try doing well this year, then Flacco's the guy, and you kind of owe it to the other players on the team to try winning now rather than just playing for the future.
yeah, that's a fair point. It's too bad to see Richardson, yeah, really struggling there after obviously missing the basically his entire rookie year too. So, yeah, we'll see how things shake out. It'll be an interesting situation to monitor here. But Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals is up next. Nate scored his third touchdown of the season in Week 8, available in nearly 90% of ESPN leagues. What do you like about this second-year wide receiver, Nate?
Oh, yeah, he's someone that's basically been on this list every week for probably the last calendar year at this point. Had the 14 PPR points, which was good to see. And it was especially good to see him getting some fantasy production in a game where Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison Jr. both had really big games, over 20 PPR points for each of them. So for me, it was always, can this Cardinals offense sustain 3 fantasy relevant receivers? If they are playing well, then I think the answer is yes, in which case Wilson is clearly the third guy. Zay Jones came back over a week ago, so has now played 2 games with the Cardinals, and he has just been cutting into Greg Dortch's playing time, not Michael Wilson's playing time. So that's been really good to see. That was one of the probably biggest concerns heading into the season, is if Zay Jones is going to cut into Michael Wilson's playing time, and that has not happened. So I think just if the Cardinals keep playing well on offense, then I think Wilson can be someone that can be a borderline fantasy starter. If the Cardinals offense is struggling, then Wilson probably won't be that relevant for fantasy purposes.
Yeah, and I mean he's a solid player, right? So like like you said, there's enough kind of passing potential in this offense to have faith in like the third receiving option there if they can keep it going, like you said. But yeah, he makes sense as a good third receiving option to consider if you need the depth. So Nate, we saw the debut of DeAndre Hopkins in Kansas City in Week 8, but we did not see Juju Smith-Schuster out there as he's been sidelined with the hamstring injury still. But even with Hopkins in the mix now, there's maybe still some fantasy potential for Juju in KC.
Yeah. So we saw Juju Smith-Schuster when he was playing, took the Rashee Rice role, which was the Tyreek Hill role back in the day. So it's the role that's clearly most relevant to fantasy purposes at wide receiver for Kansas City. And even though there was some talk that DeAndre Hopkins would play in the slot and kind of take some of those snaps as well, he only played 2 snaps in the slot the entire game. If anything, he was playing less in the slot than he has in previous times in his career, but he is very consistently been an X receiver on the teams that he's been on, and Kansas City is the team that throws the least X receivers. So I thought it was an interesting fit trade wise. In this game, he still played on the outside, was a little bit more of a Z receiver. So it was still a different role in the offense than what he's used to, but not that role that Juju Smith-Schuster was playing. Smith-Schuster playing X in 2 receiver sets, slot in 3 receiver sets. So I think Smith-Schuster will still continue to see a lot of playing time. It looks like Hopkins will just take playing time away from Xavier Worthy and Justin Watson, and Smith-Schuster could still be the one seeing a lot of targets in this offense. It's completely possible that Hopkins will just draw coverage away from other players in this offense so other players can shine. And that's a possibility at this point in Hopkins' career. So I would still want Smith-Schuster on my roster, see how things shake out. This was just one game for Hopkins after a short week of practice, so it's certainly possible they expand Hopkins' role. Maybe he does play more in the slot going forward, so I don't think anything is 100% clear in this wide receiver room, but I would still want Smith-Schuster on my roster in case he still plays in the slot and still gets a lot of targets in that role, so that's why I would pick him up.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Like I mean Hopkins obviously, like you said, joining the team on a short week. He ran I think just 14 routes out of a possible 44, so it was like 32% route participation. So still being eased into the offense. So that'll likely go up here in the next few weeks, but it doesn't mean that like if Juju can get back soon, that there still won't be like a decent piece of the pie for him to have some value, like you said, in that role. So it will be interesting to see how it shakes out here in the next couple of weeks. Okay, on to Tampa Bay, who were without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, and they'll be without Chris Godwin for the rest of the year. And Evans sounds like it'll be until after the team's Week 11 bye, apparently. So with Baker Mayfield still putting up a lot of passing yards, there's got to be someone on the other end of those throws not named Cade Otton. Shout out to him for clearing the waiver target list, by the way. But Jalen McMillan is the name that you've highlighted here, Nate.
Yeah. So the bad news here is a lot of people thought he would play in the slot for Tampa Bay this week and going forward, and that didn't happen. He played in the slot throughout college and played very well in that role. There was concern that he could only play in the slot in the NFL, and so far he's shown that that is not the case. But it was Sterling Shepard who took over in the slot for the most part. They still move players around a little bit here and there, so McMillan still getting some snaps in the slot, but it was Shepard getting the majority of snaps there. So McMillan not going to see the same role as Chris Godwin, it looks like. Always a chance they change what they're doing at some point in the season, have their bye week in, I think, week 11. So that could be a time where they change things up. But I think McMillan is still worth considering despite not having the slot role, just because of the vacated targets without Chris Godwin in the offense. McMillan, I think, out of all the two young receivers, Sterling Shepard, not a young receiver by any means anymore, but out of the receivers who are currently healthy, I think McMillan has the best chance of stepping up. He did see a lot of targets this week. Didn't always translate to catches for big gains, but he did have a decent target share. So even though he's not in the role that we ideally wanted to see, he is still someone who could get a lot of targets over the rest of the season and therefore produce and be potentially a wide receiver 3 on your team.
Yeah, like you said, like it wasn't a huge game stat wise, like just the 4 catches for 35 yards, but there's a pretty significant role there that he's playing in this offense. And as a rookie, I think, there's some likely untapped potential to kind of target here on the waiver wire if you can. So let's go on to Dallas now, and a player that we've covered here in recent weeks, and he's played well also. Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys is available in 73% of leagues, Nate.
Yeah, caught 3 passes for 44 yards. If you look at all of the wide receivers available on the waiver wire and how they've done so far this season, Tolbert's one of the top performers. A couple others near the top are there just because either they're injured or someone else on the team was injured and they stepped up for a little bit and now are back to a lesser role, where Tolbert's just been a clear starter for Dallas the entire season. We thought would be the number 3 receiver, but even when Brandon Cooks was healthy, was outperforming Cooks for the most part. A chance Cooks comes back sometime soon, but Tolbert has been playing well, one of the best performers on the waiver wire. And if the Cowboys offense starts playing better at any point this season, that would be huge for Tolbert's fantasy value. So far hasn't quite lived up to the potential, but the schedule does look fairly nice for the Cowboys going forward. Dak Prescott is someone who very much, if they are playing one of the bottom 12 offenses against quarterbacks, he's consistently ranking in the top 12. If he's playing one of the 20 other defenses, then he is not playing as well. And 6 of their last 9 games are against those 12 teams that are more favorable matchups for the Cowboys offense. So I think Tolbert does have a chance to not only continue playing well like he's been playing, but have opportunities to play even better than what we've seen so far.
Nice. Yeah. He's another one of those, I guess, like third receiving options, right? Who could very well finish kind of second or third or even first on the team in receiving on any given week, just because of that opportunity, like Michael Wilson in Arizona. And like you said, if Dallas's offense plays as well as they did like in the fourth quarter of that Sunday Night Football game, then there should be a lot more value here to take advantage of, especially for as long as Brandon Cooks is out. All right, speaking of Week 8's Sunday Night Football game and players filling in for injured starters, Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers filling in for Brandon Ayuk and Jawan Jennings really didn't have like a huge breakout game or anything like that, but still very early for the first-round rookie, Nate. So how did his usage shake out in Week 8?
He did have a pretty decent game if you include his one run for 39 yards, I think it was, but caught 4 passes for 38 yards. So a fairly good game out of him. For the most part, he was just filling in for Jennings in the slot, and then Chris Conley was taking over as the X receiver. So a little bit concerned of how things will shake up long term in the offense once everyone is healthy. Deebo Samuel also not 100% in this game, so that also could have contributed things a little bit. If Chris Conley remains the X receiver, that's going to be a problem because then Pearsall and Jennings are just competing for slot snaps, and that's not the hugest role in the 49ers offense because they do have a lot of 2 wide receiver sets as well. But if one of those wide receivers, if ideally Jennings plays that X role, or we see Deebo Samuel play that some, or we see a mix of the wide receivers and not as much Chris Conley on the field, then I think he has potential. But for me, a lot of it just boils down to he's a rookie wide receiver who has looked good in the opportunities that we've seen so far. So I'd rather have him on my team and hope that the snaps just work their way out in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a nice kind of situation, at least maybe for the short term. I know they're on a bye week in week 9, but yeah, when everybody's healthy, obviously aside from Brandon Ayuk, who's not going to be back this season, but like Deebo, Kittle, Juwan Jennings, Christian McCaffrey, like maybe just more of like a short-term option, but there's at least potential there, like you said, as a first-round rookie to kind of emerge and earn a bigger role, but might not be as large of a target share with everybody healthy. So we got an
I do want
interest.
to point out from the
Okay.
chat, David Ross mentioned Conley is week to week with an injury, by the way, a hamstring injury that he had late in the game. So that could also influence things and make things a little bit easier for Pearsall.
There you go. Thanks, David Ross. All right, interesting player up next. It's Kayshon Boutte of the New England Patriots. He's available in over 99% of ESPN leagues. So he's, able to kind of continue the tradition here of highlighting a Patriots receiving option, Nate. So you're looking at Boutte for these deeper leagues?
Yeah, he is someone who has been the clear top outside wide receiver for a couple of weeks now, kind of emerged after being pretty far down the depth chart, was talking throughout the preseason of the wide receiver rotation, and he was 7th, 8th, somewhere down the list, seemed like someone who probably wouldn't even make the roster, and he has slowly but surely worked his way up, and now these past 3 or 4 weeks now consistently being the player who sees the most playing time, runs the most routes for them, and for most of the game, he didn't do much. And then right in the last, I think 90 seconds or so of the game, had a couple catches. So that really helped his stat line. But hopefully Gain was able to get some more trust among the Patriots quarterbacks from that. And hopefully we'll see more opportunities going forward. And just hopefully the Patriots offense starts playing better going forward.
Yeah, hopefully. And then, like you said, the usage, it's been good for Boutte here. And even if Jalen Polk is back next week, there's a role for him potentially. So it could be interesting. We'll see if Drake May comes back soon as well. Like you said, and maybe help that Patriots offense. Though they did get a win against the New York Jets last week, so that was fun to see. Okay, Nate, you've paired up a couple of Carolina Panthers wide receivers here. Xavier Legette, who is rostered in 24% of ESPN leagues, and Jalen Coker is rostered in just 0.1% of leagues. Like Joanna in the chat says, is Jalen Coker a super sleeper? He looked good. I agree. The Deontay Johnson trade rumors have been kind of heating up here over the past few days/week. So there could be a big opportunity coming for one of these young wide receivers.
Yeah, reports this morning that it seems more likely than not that he will get traded. I have seen Adam Thielen as well linked in trades. He is someone who returned to practice this past week, wasn't activated for the game, but looks like he is going to be ready to come back sooner rather than later. But it would make sense for him to get traded as well. So that leaves the Panthers pretty thin at wide receiver. We saw David Moore lead the team in snaps and routes. He is someone who has been part of Dave Canales' offense for a long time now, was with him for 4 years with the Seahawks and then 1 year with the Buccaneers. So it kind of makes sense that David Moore is part of this offense. Had 4 catches for 39 yards, but Xavier Legette's one of the ones that we are more excited about because he was drafted highly. It was pretty concerning to see him see a decrease in snaps this week, considering Deontay Johnson was out again. So not quite as high on him as I was probably a week or 2 ago, but he did catch a touchdown. He did see a number of targets, was tied for the team lead in targets. But then it was Jalen Coker who had another good game for Carolina, the second good one for him this season. Caught 4 passes for 78 yards and a touchdown, so that was really good to see. And after these trades happen, ideally both wide receivers get traded for these guys to really break out. I think if Adam Thielen does come back, he might return to a starting role and see a number of targets, making it harder for these young wide receivers. But it was really good to see. And then even Jonathan Mingo was a clear fourth on the depth chart in this game. So even though he is a young wide receiver that was drafted highly, he seems like he's definitely fallen below Coker on the depth chart. So I think Coker does have an opportunity to have a lot of snaps going forward.
I think so. I think he's played well enough to kind of earn it. Like, it's been a small sample size, right? But like, I think he's only got 15 targets or something like that on the year, but he's looked good with those targets. And he actually leads the team, regardless of playing time, with 1.74 yards per route run so far this season, 15.5 yards per reception, 80.1 receiving grade, which is like by far the best mark on the team. The next closest is Deontay Johnson with a 68.4. So we kind of saw Jalen Coker do this in college and be ultra efficient with his opportunities. And yeah, it was the FCS, so whatever. But now he's doing it in the NFL. And even on a small sample, like, it's pretty encouraging stuff here for Coker. And, in any deep leagues that he's available, I'd be scooping him up, especially with the usage, like you said, and Deontay Johnson possibly getting traded. Who knows with Adam Thielen as well. So actually, David Ross in the comments here, what do you think of the odds here that Jalen Coker is more valuable down the stretch than Cedric Tillman, for example? So like we mentioned, and David Ross mentions as well, the Browns schedule is pretty rough. They're not going to play the Ravens every week, like he says. So do you have a preference for either one of these guys rest of the season? Let's assume that Deontay Johnson gets traded.
Yeah. Like, my preference is still Tillman because we talked about him first, but I think for me, it's because Tillman, I can be decently confident he'll be the top wide receiver for Cleveland going forward, where I'm not as confident for Coker. I still have some confidence that Xavier Legette can be that top guy, and he did get more targets than Coker this week. But I do think there is at least a chance that Coker is the better option of the two. He can become that top wide receiver for Carolina on a weekly basis, and the schedule is a bit nicer for Carolina than it is Cleveland. Panthers have the third best schedule for fantasy wide receivers for wide receivers in the fantasy playoffs, matchups against the Cardinals and Buccaneers in that stretch. So some very nice matchups for Carolina there.
Nice. Yeah, really like Jalen Coker. I would be taking a shot there where he's available. But yeah, obviously Tillman in a really great spot already here. So, okay, Nate, one of the other trades that happened involved the Las Vegas Raiders trading away Davante Adams, which allowed Trey Tucker to move up the depth chart. So what did you see with his usage this past week?
Oh, yeah. Usage-wise, it's been pretty consistent throughout the season, even when they had Davante Adams and Jacoby Myers at 100%. Tucker was the clear third wide receiver, and they were using lots of three wide receiver sets because they've been passing the ball a lot, trying to catch up to teams throughout the season. And Tucker's was the number one wide receiver for a number of weeks when Myers was injured. Now the number two wide receiver. And then Brock Bowers is there as well as the tight end. So anyone who's the number two wide receiver is the third receiving option. So kind of similar to Arizona in that if the offense is playing well enough, they can have three fantasy relevant players and the receiving game. If not, then they probably won't. So not super optimistic about Tucker. He is still one of the highest performing players over the course of the season so far who's available on the waiver wire. And then also included him because the Raiders have the best schedule for wide receivers from weeks 14 to week 17. So if the Raiders offense does start playing a little bit better down the stretch, then the schedule is really nice that Tucker could have some big games near the end of the season.
Thanks. All right, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Think of a time recently when you didn't feel like you could be your full self, like you were hiding behind a mask. October is the season for wearing masks and costumes, but some of us feel like we wear a mask and hide more often than we want to. At work and social settings around our family, therapy can help you to learn to accept all parts of yourself so you could take off the mask, because masks should be for Halloween fun, not for our emotions. Therapy can be really useful to get a better understanding of how your mind actually works and become more aware of your own patterns of behavior and how to improve them. It's useful for everybody, not just people struggling with something specific. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a convenient, flexible, and entirely online way to get therapy that's right for you. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Take off the mask with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/PFFfantasy to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/PFFfantasy. All right, Nate, we got some tight ends to talk about, and we're going to start where we always do with Taysom Hill. But this time, Hill actually played a game back in the lineup after missing 3 straight, dealing with the ribs injury, but he's back now. So, how did things look in week 8 for our mascot of the waiver wire tight ends?
Looked fairly decent. Got a lot of playing time, which was good to see. In his first game back, was playing all over the place at quarterback, running back, tight end, slot receiver, outside receiver, and on special teams. And he threw a pass in this game. He ran the ball a couple times, and he also caught a couple of passes, which was good to see at a decent target share in this game. And I think once Derek Carr is back in the offense, things will look a little bit better in general. Kendre Miller suffered a hamstring injury again, so a chance that he'll miss some time, in which case Hill could see even more carries going forward. So it's just the same thing that it's been all season, and that a lot of tight ends are very inconsistent. We've seen even guys like Cole Kmet, who had 2 really great weeks, but outside of that has not been a fantasy starter. Hill is that same kind of boat where there's going to be most weeks where he might not score a ton of fantasy points, but he's going to have a higher floor than some of these other tight ends because he gets those carries, and then he has a higher ceiling as well. And one of his couple of games this season, he scored 2 touchdowns, and that's a game where he missed most of the game. So his heights are going to be higher than a lot of other tight ends because he's going to score touchdowns more than a lot of other tight ends are. So Hill, I think, is someone who can be a fantasy starter in a lot of weeks over the rest of the season.
Yeah, and he led the Saints passing options in QBR as well. He went 1 for 1. But so he might just be their best quarterback until Derek Carr returns. We'll see what happens there. But obviously, yeah, we've talked about the usage. We like Taysom Hill's role in that offense quite a bit here. And then another one of our usual suspects here at tight end, it's Noah Fant for the Seattle Seahawks. What do we like about his fantasy potential, Nate?
Yeah, first we'll miss talking about Kate Otten here like we have for the past month plus, but we'll move on to Noah Fant now. Fant is someone that I would pick up specifically if you have George Kittle on your team. The 49ers have a bye week this week, and you need a tight end for this week. Faces the Los Angeles Rams. Fant is someone who's been kind of up and down throughout the season. His playing time is somewhat limited because they like rotating their tight ends a little bit, but Fant still is someone who is a decent receiving option. A chance DK Metcalf misses another game, even though ideally he'll be back, but faces the Rams, who have allowed a lot of fantasy points to tight ends. Part of that is simply the tight ends they face. They have faced some of the better tight ends in the league and allowed a lot of passing yards to those players. But even guys like Josh Oliver, Elijah Hickens have scored touchdowns against the Rams this season. So a chance Fant finds the end zone. So out of all the tight ends, if you need someone specifically for this week and you don't want to take a chance on Taysom Hill because he's a more unique player, Fant is probably the best option for this week among the traditional tight ends.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, it was a quiet week for him in week 8, but it was for all the Seattle receiving options really in a tough matchup against the Bills without DK Metcalf in the lineup. But like you said, better matchup here in week 9 against the Los Angeles Rams. Okay, Nate, Will Dissly of the Los Angeles Chargers is next up. We talked about him last week coming off that Monday Night Football game where he led that entire game in receiving production and had a relatively solid game here in week 8 as well. So what do we like about Will Dissly?
Yeah, caught 5 passes for 41 yards, which was good to see. The big thing there is Hayden Hurst missed another game with an injury, so just they remain that top receiving option for the Chargers. Again, his game this week was better than anything we've seen out of Hurst this season. His game last week was better than anything we've seen out of Hurst, but there is still a chance that Hurst just goes back to his usual role of being the receiving tight end going forward. That's why Dissly is a little bit lower on this list. If we knew that Dissly would be the primary receiving tight end for the Chargers the rest of the season, then I'd be pretty high on him just because the coaching staff has a strong tradition with tight ends, with Mark Andrews going back to San Francisco with Vernon Davis. So I think Dissly could have a ton of targets going forward if he remains that receiving tight end, but there's no guarantee that that's the case.
Yeah. And I mean, his 2 best games in terms of target totals have come over the last 2 weeks as well, right? Like 11 in week 7, 7 in week 8. So he's somehow second on the team in targets with 32 and receptions as well with 26. So, you could do worse when looking at guys who are available in 99% of leagues. Nate, you have Brenton Strange of the Jacksonville Jaguars up next. Not because there was an Evan Ingram injury, so don't worry there, Ingram managers, but maybe to do with the Jags losing both of their top wide receivers this past week, Nate, with Christian Kirk done for the year and Brian Thomas Jr. dealing with a chest injury that's likely to sideline him for a bit as well.
Yeah, they lost Gabe Davis even earlier
Right.
in that game, and we don't know how long he's out for yet, but had been dealing with, I think it was a knee injury, and now dealing with the shoulder. Don't remember what it was, but I know his new injury was different than the injury that had kept him limited in practice. So at the end of the game, the Jaguars were down to 2 wide receivers, which they used 12 personnel for the rest of the game, with Strange as one of those 2 tight ends on the field. So Strange getting more playing time, and I think with Christian Kirk out for the year, we could see Jacksonville use a lot more 12 personnel with how comfortable they've gotten with Strange. And Strange in general, looking at his numbers so far, have been pretty similar to Ingram's. So I think there's a chance that with the Jaguars 2-6 at some point can start looking to next year. And Strange is only 23 years old. Ingram's over 30 at this point, so Strange is the future at tight end for Jacksonville. So there's a chance that we start seeing more and more Strange over the season. But also, it's worth noting with Ingram, last year when Christian Kirk went down with the injury, that's when Ingram really started to step up. His fantasy production was a top 2 or so tight end once Kirk went down with injury. So I think there will be a lot of targets going to tight ends going forward. Not trusting Strange this week by any means, but I would consider picking him up in deeper leagues just in case Jacksonville starts having 12 personnel as their base offense, or Strange starts to really cut into Ingram's playing time.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I mean, look, Strange finished second on the team in receiving yards this past week with 59, and he led the team with 5 receptions as well. So there could be a role there just out of necessity, like you said, because of the lack of wide receiver options. I know they were a team that at least played an above average rate of 11 personnel, but it wouldn't be a surprise to kind of see them make that shift just because of the options that they have right now. So, next up is an old friend and one we probably haven't talked about for a bit. Chig Okonkwo of the Tennessee Titans. DeAndre Hopkins obviously out of the picture. You think there's some room here for Chig to make some noise in the back half of the season?
Potentially, yeah. With Hopkins out, Traylon Burks also on injured reserve right now, so they've kind of had to dig deep on the wide receiver depth chart. Nick Westbrook-Akine becoming a starter in this offense. So I think there is a little bit more room to target tight ends. Okonkwo's playing time has increased a little bit over time. That's mostly due to more 2 tight end usage and more tight ends on the field in general. But basically since week 2, it's been a very slow and steady rise. The big thing here is the Titans play the Bengals, Colts, and Jaguars during the fantasy playoffs. And those are 3 of the top 7 teams at allowing fantasy points to tight end. So he's someone that if he starts playing better over the next month or so, he has a really big opportunity in the fantasy playoffs. So I don't think it's the most likely thing that he becomes a fantasy starter this season. But if you are getting to a point where you're getting past bye weeks and you're looking more so to stash players on your bench who could break out over the rest of the season at tight end, I think Okonkwo is one of the top options who could break out by December.
Yeah, would be cool to see. Let's go to the last tight end on the list here. Theo Johnson of the New York Giants. He's been their leading receiving tight end right now. He had 3 catches for 35 yards. Played last night on Monday Night Football. Wasn't like a huge game, but a decent role here for in the Giants offense for Theo, our Canadian hero.
Yeah, he is among the tight ends who have run the most routes this season, which is great to see. He just has not been targeted nearly enough. Had a couple of targets this week, which was good to see. But just anyone who has a lot of targets is worth considering. And the Giants do have a top 5 schedule for tight ends over the rest of the season, top 5 schedule during the fantasy playoffs. So if they start trusting him more in the passing game, had a couple of nice catches in this game, a chance he can be a fantasy relevant tight end. And at least he has that role worked out and the schedule worked out. He just needs to see more targets.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm just looking before we go on to the quarterbacks, looking at questions. There's a lot of start sit questions. We'll save those for later in the week. Nate does a start sit like an hour or so, I think, on Discord every Sunday morning at 9:30. So that's a good place to start those. And I know, Nate, you haven't done your rankings yet for the week either. So hard to kind of answer the start sit questions here on Tuesday morning, but we'll be in a better spot to get to those in later weeks. We'll focus on the waiver wire stuff this week. So let's wrap up with some quarterbacks, Nate. And the first name on the list is a rookie quarterback, Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos, who has been excellent here recently.
Oh, yeah, he has finally won me over. This was his third time having a top 10 fantasy performance in his past 4 weeks, which was good to see. And it's not just his passing the ball well, he is also running a lot. 29 carries for 149 yards and 2 touchdowns over the past 4 weeks. So he is among the top rushing quarterbacks so far this season. So I think he is the best a quarterback, not just potentially long-term, but also this upcoming week faces the Baltimore Ravens, who have allowed the third most fantasy points to quarterbacks, just allowed that huge game to Jameis Winston. So I think Nix, if you are looking for a quarterback this week, is the best option, but also if you are looking for a quarterback long-term who can be a top 10 guy potentially the rest of the year, I think Nix has the best shot of getting there of these waiver wire options.
Yeah, I like him. I mean, we talked about him on the Start Sit show this week. Nick had him as a QB streamer, and he nailed it because Nick's finished as the overall QB2, and he was really good. He's been really good lately, taking advantage of some favorable matchups, and like you said, a nice matchup here again in Week 9. So Sam Darnold is our next QB on the list, just barely making it under that 50% rostership threshold for you use in the article. We still like the Vikings quarterback here quite a bit.
Yeah, averaging 17.4 fantasy points per game. His main bad game was against the New York Jets, who have been very good against quarterbacks this season, so he has generally played well. I know we did have that start question about TJ Hawkinson. He should be back this week, and I do think if he's back, he'll be getting a lot of playing time and playing well, so if anything, that should help Darnold's fantasy value and also be good for anyone who has been holding on to Hawkinson all season. Not the greatest schedule for the Vikings over the rest of the year, but I think Darnold has been playing well enough that probably not going to be someone who you want in your starting lineup every week. But if you have a quarterback with the bye week, you can do far worse than Darnold as your quarterback.
Yeah, and same thing with Miami Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. Also just meets the rostership threshold, but returned to action this past week. It was a nice matchup for him to provide some fantasy potential, but didn't quite get there against Arizona. Have to imagine we get better fantasy performances from Tua in future weeks.
Oh yeah, just generally the offense played better. Bo Nix plays Baltimore this week. I must have misspoke, but Baltimore this week. But Tua didn't play the greatest in a good matchup, but the offense did look a lot better. We finally saw Tyreek Hill catching a lot of passes. We saw Jalen Waddle getting a little bit more involved. We saw the run game looking good again. So the Dolphins offense looked a lot more like the Dolphins offense we expected with Tua back. And Tua was a top 10 quarterback overall last year. By per game, it was a little bit lower, but he's kind of had some streaks where he has been very, very good as a fantasy quarterback and then not quite as good as a fantasy quarterback. So I think there is a chance that Tua, if things are going well, could light things up over the rest of the season or at least over a stretch of the games. But it'll just be interesting to see if the Dolphins offense is able to pick things up. But I think it's worth checking. And it was just one game after missing a lot of games for Tua. So not overly concerned by him not scoring a ton of fantasy points this week.
Yeah, and I mean Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle are begging to become fantasy relevant again. Waddle specifically is killing me, but please Tua get better. So we got to imagine that he will. How about Matthew Stafford, who had a great game on Thursday night, throwing for 4 touchdown passes. He gets his top 2 wide receivers back in Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, Nate.
Oh yeah, Nakua immediately having 100 yards after being limited in practice for 2 practices. I'm not sure why he wasn't practicing earlier than that, considering how well he played, but who knows how his injury recovery ended up happening that way. But the offense looked great with both the wide receivers back, which was good to see. We've seen Stafford at times. He was a top 5 fantasy quarterback a couple years ago with the wide receivers playing well. Over the past 2-3 years, hasn't been a consistent fantasy quarterback, but there's at least a chance that with the wide receivers back, the offense starts playing a lot better. And they have a decent, or they have pretty rough stretch of games upcoming, but once you get closer to the fantasy playoffs, it does get slightly better. But I think it's worth at least considering just with how well the offense looked this week. But there are quarterbacks that have better schedules than Stafford.
Fair. And we have to talk about Jameis Winston, who replaces Deshaun Watson and performs significantly better, even gets the win against the Ravens, throws for over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. The Browns QB1 is here, Nate.
Yeah, someone that in the Scott Fish Bowl I picked up last week and spent over 20% of my waiver on, and no one else bid anything above 0%. So overspent a little bit to get him, but still, he looked very good in this one. Had a 300-yard game, which is something Deshaun Watson has not done with the Cleveland Browns in his 3 years. So an instant improvement to the offense there, graded very well in the game as well. Same thing with Cedric Tillman, though, just a brutal schedule for quarterbacks, just week after week after week of tough matchups for the most part. That once we get to the fantasy playoffs, the matchups do get a little bit better. So at least for quarterback, maybe not necessarily for wide receiver. So that is the one silver lining that I think Winston, once we get to the fantasy playoffs, can be a better player. But I do think we'll have a rough stretch of games for Winston and the offense. But if anything, hopefully that just means a lot of passing attempts and a lot of passing yards from those attempts.
Yeah. Also worth pointing out, the Browns offensive line has allowed like a ton of pressure this season, like more than any team in the league by a lot. But this past week, they were just like league average in that regard. So that was a nice improvement. Also fewer sacks allowed. So maybe things are looking up in Cleveland. We did get a question just related to Cleveland, and we talked about wide receivers now. So just quickly kind of come back to it. KJ Frederick asked, should I drop Jalen McMillan for Cedric Tillman or Elijah Moore in full PPR? I know you had Cedric Tillman at the top of the list. Jalen McMillan was slightly below him. So feeling better about Tillman over McMillan rest of season?
Yeah, generally we go in order of the players that I prefer, even though in general there are nuances of if you're looking for a guy this week versus long term. But the wide receivers in general, a lot of them were just more long term options than specifically this week. So I would go with Tillman over McMillan if you can.
There you go. Okay, we saw Daniel Jones on Monday Night Football. Didn't throw any touchdowns, but still, he's been solid here, for the most part, at least better than, I guess, better than really poor. I don't know how to describe Daniel Jones. He's a very strange quarterback to watch, but he makes the waiver wire list this week, rostered in about 15% of ESPN leagues. How are you feeling about Daniel Jones rest of the season?
A little rough. He usually has a good rushing floor. He only ran 3 times for 1 yards last night. But the big thing with him is the Giants have the best schedule for quarterbacks. A lot of the quarterbacks that we were talking about that looked good last week, with the exception of Bo Nix, they don't have great schedules over the rest of the year, where Jones does have that great schedule. So we've seen him be a top 10 fantasy quarterback before, because usually he has that high rushing floor and then also has to pass the ball a lot, so has passing volume to go along with that. And then Malik Neighbors, playing well early in the season, had a decent game with 7 catches for 71 yards. Darius Slayton had the 100-yard game. So a chance that he continues to have to get a lot of passing yards, and then also runs the ball more than he did last night in some good matchups. So that's why I include him on the list, but I understand at basically all the positions I have someone on this list who hasn't played so well so far this season, but the schedule is so good that if they start playing a little bit better, then they could see a huge boost in production.
Yeah, and I mean, last night too, like the offensive line was obviously, not struggling against. I mean, understandably against T.J. Watt and Alex Highsmith, but Andrew Thomas being out for the year as well, like their best offensive lineman, is a big problem as well. So that could continue to be an issue in strong pass rush matchups for the defense, but there's potential, like you said, with a favorable matchup here, or a favorable schedule down the road. All right, last one, Nate. It's Andy Dalton, who didn't play in week 8 because he was in a car accident. So glad he's okay, but the team decided to give him the this week off. Bryce Young stepped in and started again, but you're expecting the team to go back to Dalton after this?
Oh yeah, it did sound like if Young played well enough that he would keep the job, but I'm not sure he did. So it does end up being Bryce Young going forward, then Young would be the player that I'm targeting here. The big thing is the Panthers have a great schedule in the fantasy playoffs, play the Cowboys, Cardinals, and Buccaneers. Expect them to be a team where they are going to have to pass the ball a lot in every game. So that means a lot of passing volume. So if you have a lot of passing volume against teams that have allowed a lot of passing production this season, that could lead to fantasy relevant performances. We did see Dalton look fairly good earlier this season. So I think there's a chance that there could be a quarterback in Carolina that is relevant during the fantasy playoffs, but it does have to be a situation where they start playing a little bit better over November.
Makes sense. And he's got a new wide receiver one in Jalen Coker as well. So so let's go. I think that is gonna do it here for this week's waiver wire targets. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you get to those waiver wires, get your claims in, stay active all season long, and we'll continue to provide more waiver targets every single week. Shout out to the PFF data collection team as always for all this data that we reference in these episodes is thanks to that amazing team. Nate, thank you for putting this together as always. And before you go, as long as there isn't any breaking news regarding like a Deontay Johnson trade or anything like that, please remind everyone what you have going on at pff.com this week.
Yeah, I have expected Johnson to get traded to the Jets at this point, but hasn't happened yet. But have the recap up for all the games from this past week. There were no bye weeks, so all 16 games I have recaps for. The waiver wire, if you want to see that in written form. Also have rest of season rankings, have 5 to add, 5 to buy low, or 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high up today. We'll have my rankings up in a couple of hours for this upcoming week. So if you are making waiver wire decisions based on who's going to play better this week, that will be up on the website. I'll tweet it out once it's up as well. So keep an eye out there. After that, we'll have start sit article on Thursday and then the Thursday night recap, and then we'll do everything all over again with another normal week in the NFL. No early Sunday games, no double Monday games, just a normal week of games playing when they usually play.
Yeah, as normal as it can be in the NFL. And then as for me, I'll have the IDP fantasy report out here shortly today, followed by the wide receiver man zone coverage report on Thursday morning, IDP rankings, as well as the O-line, D-line matchup articles to target and avoid. I'll be back in the podcast feed doing the IDP Week 8 preview, as well as the Week 8 start sit show with Nick Bodiford on Thursday as well. So be sure to check all of those out. And until next time, peace out.